You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, everybody. This is Matt. As you may know, you might recognize my voice. However, today we've got something brand new for you that we're very excited about, and you should be excited about it too. You might recall a few episodes ago, we had Kendra Debany on. She is the owner of Gettysburg House Histories. It's a wonderful service for people who have old houses and they want to know the history of their house. And we had such a good time with her, and you guys had given us such good feedback about the subject matter and her performance that we decided, you know what? Let's do something interesting that will not only enhance your education, but also entertain you, I'm sure, and just break up the monotony of having to listen to me and Eric. Boy, oh boy, that's got to be annoying. Right, Eric?
Right, Matt.
Okay. So we have Kendra Debany with us today. Hello, Kendra.
Hello, Matt.
And what are we going to do today? Well, tell us what we're going to do.
Today we're going to talk about a house that's in the area that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. One of my recurring themes for these podcasts that I'm going to do for you, I'm going to talk about the battle beyond the borders. I want to talk about some of these houses that are just outside of the official park boundaries that a lot of people have seen, some they haven't seen, but things that have happened at some of these farms. Don't worry, we will talk about some of the battlefield houses along the way, and we're also going to talk about different aspects of different houses. So we'll talk about, you know, the houses, the owners, the barns, the farms, the fields, what kind of crops they were growing, and ownership, architecture, property boundaries, different tips and tricks.
Maybe things that they had in old houses that we don't have now, and why they had them, or
we'll go through,
or why they don't have closets.
Oh yeah. Welcome to old home ownership.
Yeah. Okay, so today we're recording the first couple that we're going to hear, and folks, you're going to hear them once a month. Once a month, we're going to have Kendra do the weekly upload, talking about a different property, and it's just going to be her. It's not going to be me and her. I'm just doing this here because it's the introductory one, but that's it. There's nothing more to it. That's what Kendra's going to do. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Kendra, and I'm going to go take a nap because this is nice to not have to, be the one to pull the show along. It's all on Kendra now. Sink or swim, succeed or fail. It's in Kendra's hands. No pressure.
There's no such thing as failure.
No, there isn't. You'll do fine.
You go take your nap now.
I'm going to go take my nap. I'm going to mute my mic, and I'm going to let you go. Have fun, Kendra. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoy this.
Okay, so first thing I wanted to tell you, on my if you follow along on my Facebook page, Gettysburg House Histories, when this episode is released, I'm going to put out some photos to go along with it so you can see what the house looked like, a little bit of what we talk about here today. So let's get right into it. This is a house that I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with. It is the Abraham Spangler farm. This house is located at 1118 Baltimore Pike. And if you come out of the Visitor Center parking lot onto the Baltimore Pike and you hang a left, this house actually sits on your right. It's a half stone, half log house, and it's the house that's associated with Spangler's Spring at the time of the battle, which I'm sure all of you know about. Now, what I'm going to do with the house histories is I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the early land ownership, the Civil War owner, the Civil War, what the farm looked like, what the owners were like, what their lives were like, what happened to them during the battle, what happened to them after the battle, and walk you through all the way down to the current owner now. So we'll start in the really early. Laughlin McKillier, and yes, I butcher names, very, very common to, some of these are questionable. He was actually the first settler associated with this land, and he appears in this area around 1760. When the Black's Gap Road was being surveyed in the late 1760s, his name actually appeared as a homeowner and the general location of where the house is today. It is not the house that's there today. The first settlers on in this area, when they came in, would actually set up what I would call a log cabin, which is kind of a quickie structure. And then later on, the second generation homes that they would build would be more of a permanent log house structure. So McKillier is here until 1771 when he moves with his family to North Carolina. Don't know why. But there's a gap in the ownership. Now, I am relentless. Anybody who knows me knows that I am relentless at trying to find and link the title all the way back. And when there's a gap, it drives me crazy. So I have dug through everything that could possibly be found, any kind of information to give us the owners during this time period, and have come up empty-handed. So I have to take a hit on this one and say there's a gap from 1771 to 1793 of I don't know who owned it. But in 1793, Daniel Heck Sr. purchases the property. Now, I just want to talk really. Some of the tools that I use in house research are so fun. Some of these, it is absolutely downright amazing what kind of information you can find in 1798 as opposed to 1998. It's absolutely amazing. And one of my favorite sources is actually the 1798 direct tax lists. So what is the direct tax list? In 1798, the United States, or what was the United States at the time, actually imposed a tax. And this was also called the window tax. You may have heard of it as the window tax. So what would happen is the tax taker would run around and he would take measurements and check out how many windows each building had. Glass at the time was imported from England, so it was very expensive. So if your house had a number of windows with a number of panes of glass, you were wealthy and you paid a higher tax. And this tax was actually to help pay for the debt caused from the American Revolution. So we were still carrying a heavy burden of debt from that time. I love this because not only did they tell you what kind of structures, they gave you the measurements, they gave you how many stories the house was, they told you about the outbuildings. So this is great. So on this property, Daniel Heck's property is described as having a house built of, quote, new logs, indicated as being 2 stories in height, having 5 windows and 12 panes of glass, and measuring 28 by 22 feet. He also had a kitchen made of old logs, measuring 18 feet by 16 feet, and a new log barn measuring 55 feet by 22 feet. The total amount of land he owned was 198 acres. So from this one source, I always say, and I said on my original podcast, being a house historian is a little bit like being a detective, and you take all of the clues and you put together the pieces of the puzzle to make an overall image of what the house was. So from this one source, I know that the log portion of the house that stands today was built sometime between 1793, when Heck first took over ownership of the land, and 1798, when this direct tax was taken. And how do I know this? I know this because the direct tax states that it was built of new logs as opposed to old logs. New logs indicates that the house and the barn were recently constructed, and old logs indicates that it is an older structure, probably that first period cabin that we talked about. Now, for anyone who listened to my first podcast at the end of January, I explained to Matt how some of the owners often reused their earlier log houses as summer kitchens. In many instances, they simply built a new house up against the original log house. But in other circumstances, they would move the log house from its original location and place it up against the new house. I think this is probably what's going on, that they're reusing the original log cabin and building this new log house. So just to reiterate on that, the log structure that stands on the house that's out there today was built sometime between 1793 and 1798. Now, here's something interesting. Daniel Heck Sr. actually operated this house as a tavern. So in 1800, he acquired a tavern license. Now, like today, where you have to go out and get a liquor license to sell liquor in your establishment, back then you needed a tavern license to sell liquor. And in order to get your tavern license back then, you had to have people in the township vouch for you. They vouched for your credibility. They vouched that you were a person of good standing, that your reputation was flawless. And you also have to obviously put in the application. So you'll often see in the newspapers when somebody is applying for a tavern license that there's a number of neighbors, friends, family who are giving their names and saying, we vouch for the credibility of this person. Now, Heck's house was run as a tavern for a number of years. It actually stopped being a tavern in 1830 under Abraham Spangler's ownership. So we'll talk about Spangler in a minute, but when Spangler took over, he only ran it as a tavern for a couple years. Daniel Heck died in December of 1824, and the property was seized by the sheriff to pay his debts. Unfortunately, Daniel Heck liked to invest in real estate and perhaps wasn't quite as financially savvy as he thought he was, and he ran into a lot of financial problems. So his intention was to leave it to his sons or have his sons. He offered it that his sons could purchase the property. He did not leave it to them. But unfortunately, he just had too much debt, so the property was seized by the sheriff to pay off that debt. But it sounds terrible to say, but we really like it when a sheriff seizes the property to pay off debt. And why do we love when the sheriff takes it over? Sounds terrible to say, but we love it because a lot of times the sheriff is going to put an advertisement for the property for sale in the newspaper. And what do we get? We get a nice description. So here we go again. In 1825, we have a new description of the property. It says that it contains 220 acres, that there's a sufficient portion of meadow and timberland. There are on the premises a commodious 2-story house, part stone and part log, calculated for a tavern stand. They have a large yard with 2 pumps of never-failing water in it and a large stone bank barn, a spring house, and other outhouses. Now, from this advertisement, we know that the stone portion of the house was standing as of August of 1825. Isn't this fun? These are great. So this is what's so fun about house research. The little clues, the detective clues, are coming into place here. This means that the house was built sometime between 1798, when the direct tax was taken, and 1825 from this advertisement. So I had actually stumbled across one source that said that the stone portion of the house was built in 1819. And after having been inside of it and inspected it and looked at the architecture of it, I would be very comfortable to say that's a real good date for the stone section. Another interesting note, in case you caught that, the 1798 log barn has been replaced by this time with a large stone barn. So there's another nice little tidbit for us. And the barn today is not standing, But where it actually stood, if you're heading north or into town, and the house is on your right, the barn actually stood across the street and a little closer to town. So I'm pretty sure you can actually see a little bit of the stone foundation still there today. That I think it's somebody's driveway now. So that's 1825. Now, on April 3rd, 1827, Abraham Spangler purchased the property at the sheriff's sale. So let's talk a little bit about the Spanglers, the Spangler family. I want to give you a little bit of background. We're not going to really beat them to death, but we're going to really talk a little bit about each of the owners. I want you to get to know them. Abraham Spangler was married to Elizabeth, and together they had 11 children, 7 of whom were born in this house. Spangler was active in local politics, and he did a little bit of real estate investing in addition to his full-time job as farmer. Now, one of the properties he bought in 1840, a lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. Some of my battlefield buffs, no doubt, know this property. It was the Samuel Cobean farm, it sits back off, anybody who knows it sits back off the Carlisle Road north of town. It sits off the road, down a long lane. So Spangler purchased that in 1840, and he actually was the one who sold it to Samuel Cobean in 1854. So there's just a little bit of interesting information. Now, there's quite a bit of confusion about the Spangler family. Who lived where, when, which houses were rented, who was where. So here's some things I want you to remember. Here's the quickie breakdown. Abraham Spangler was the owner of this property on the Baltimore Pike at the time of the battle, but he did not live there. He did early on, but not at the time of the battle. His son Henry was the one renting the farm. So a lot of times there's confusion, and you'll hear of this as it's the Henry Spangler farm. No, it's the Abraham Spangler farm. I always go with the owner. So for me, this is the Abraham Spangler farm, but Henry is the renter. Abraham was actually living, you got to keep following now, this is going to get confusing. Abraham was actually living along the Chambersburg Pike at the time of the battle. In 1855, he had purchased 30 acres of land from somebody else you're probably familiar with, Frederick Herr. Probably most of you have heard of the Herr Tavern. This land, the 30 acres that he bought, actually was on the opposite side of the pike from the Herr Tavern and down the hill, closer to Willoughby's Run, but not on Willoughby's Run. So at the time of the battle, that's where Abraham Spangler was living. Now, moving on to another Spangler here. At the time of the battle, Henry actually owned the Spanglers farm along the Emmitsburg Road behind the Sherfy house that everybody's familiar with that one as well. He rented this out. I believe the renter was Eckenrode at the time of the battle. So Henry is living on the Baltimore Pike. Abraham is living on the Chambersburg Pike, and the Henry Spangler farm on the Emmitsburg Road is being rented out. The Emmitsburg Road property, Henry had actually purchased from the Plank Estate in 1862. So this was a new purchase for him shortly before the battle. He actually purchased it from his wife's, from his father-in-law's estate. Okay, so to recap, it's Abraham Spangler owns the Baltimore Pike property. Henry's renting. Abraham's on the Chambersburg Pike. Henry owns the Battlefield Farm, but it's being rented. So maybe another episode we might go into detail, and I'll tell you a little more about the history of the Henry Spangler Farm. That might be an interesting topic for another show. Okay, back to the Baltimore Pike Spangler Farm. When did Henry start renting? Well, records seem to indicate that it was shortly after Abraham purchased his Chambersburg Pike land in 1855. Henry got married I want to say it was 1855 that he got married. And he moved into the property. For a year, he actually rented the farm with his brother Elias, but Elias ended up moving elsewhere, and it was just Henry rented the entire house. So what do we know about Henry Spangler? He was born in 1830, and he was married to Sarah. She was, as I just said, a plank. They had 8 children, 4 of whom would be born after the battle. At the time of the battle, the Spangler property consisted of 175 acres of improved land, which is farmed land. So he was farming 175 acres. That's a lot of land to farm. And he had 55 acres of unimproved land or woodlots. Every property at this time had sufficient woodlots. You used wood for everything, for cooking, for heating, for everything. So he had 55 acres in his woodlots. Henry Spangler was a highly productive farmer. This land was, his amounts on the agricultural census are really outstanding. So this land was in a really high state of cultivation at the time of the battle. Some of the farmers on the agricultural census, they're barely scraping by, but Henry was doing really well for himself. I'm going to preface this next part by saying my focus is always on the houses, the people, the farms, the outbuildings, the architecture. I am not a battlefield guide. I am not this regiment moved here and then moved here and then this one was detached. So for information on the Spangler farm, I suggest you read, there's a bunch of books on it. Ask a guide. But I am not going to go into details about the military aspects of it. I couldn't even if I wanted to. So, but I will say we're going to talk about the Battle of Gettysburg, what happened to the farm, the people, the owners, their fields, their livelihood. When the Battle of Gettysburg took place, Abraham Spangler's farm, as a lot of you know, was just smack dab in the middle of the chaos. Troops were being rushed back and forth along the Baltimore Pike. The fighting was taking place on a huge portion of his farm. The house pretty much was in a very dangerous position, and it was a very, very hot place to be. The specific details of what the family did or where they went is unknown. This is kind of common. If you have some good oral histories or they talk about it a lot in their damage claim, you can kind of find out where people are moving around to. But otherwise, what I do is I take the information that I've learned from researching other properties and to put together what was going on at the time of the battle for this family. When did they leave? What did they see? Where did they go? So most likely, I'm going to say that this family left the farm on the second day of the battle, which seems to be the case with what I've seen with families in the general area. On the first, they knew there was a fight coming, but they probably felt safe enough to stay around. They may have left late on the night of the first, after the day's fighting, or first thing in the morning on the second would be my guess. And let's remember, all of the Spangler children are really young. The oldest at this time is only 6 years old, so you certainly don't want to be stuck behind with a bunch of really young children and soldiers entering your house and cannonballs flying into it. So I've heard various stories through the years, and I always say it takes a special degree. They need to create a new degree out there. It takes a special degree to weed out the fact from the fiction. On some of these stories, they're crazy. One story said that an old deaf man stayed in his basement, stayed in the Spangler basement throughout the battle, and he had no idea what was going on because he couldn't hear anything. I don't know who this is. I don't know. That one it's just something I've heard. Another one that I heard was that Mrs. Spangler said that she saw that one of her quilts was taken from the house, and that she later saw it wrapped around a wounded soldier who was being carried in a wagon down the Baltimore Pike in the days following the battle. Now, that one I can definitely buy. That one I believe. But some of the stories I've heard have been so out there. Like one tour I did, one of the stories that I heard was that they sent their 7-year-old girl out to the farm to collect body parts and bury them. So, some of these stories are really out there. Now, the family farm suffered extensive damages. The farm, the house, the barn, the fields. It's easy for it's easier for us to say, well, the house had extensive damages, but when you really sit back and you think about what actually took place, what actually did they see, we can't even wrap our heads around this. But I'll try to paint you the picture. On the Spangler farm, I know that the house and their barn were used for hospital purposes, so we can pretty much assure that they were bloody and really damaged. And I'm sure other of the outbuildings on the property were used as well. Both buildings also sustained battle damage from artillery shells and bullets. Now, the Elliott burial map, which was drawn just after the battle to show where soldiers from both armies were buried. The Elliott burial map is a very interesting researching tool because it actually shows where the Confederates and the Unions were buried. And its main purpose was, it was July of 1863. There were so many dead that they had to very quick in the smell. So they had to very quickly get these bodies into the ground. So the Elliott burial map was actually a tool to help for when they were going to exhume the bodies for reburial so they would know where everybody was. That Elliott burial map actually shows that there were a number of burials on the Spangler property, including a bunch of them just to the north of their house. So picture yourself, and I've been in their house, so I can easily picture this, and looking out the back door and seeing, all these dead soldiers being buried in your backyard. It's hard for us to picture this. The fields, Spangler's fields were so heavily damaged by the wagons, the artillery, and troops. The crops were taken, the fences were dismantled and used for firewood. Pretty much everything that Henry had worked so hard to make so productive was destroyed in 3 or 4 days. It was just destroyed. Matt and I were talking before the show about how badly some of these fields were damaged, and the ruts from the wagons afterwards, when they had the heavy rain on the evening of the 3rd, all these ruts, it just turned the fields into quagmires, and the mud just ran. These fields were so heavily damaged by movement. It would take a long time for the farmers around here to rebuild. Now, after the battle, both Henry and Abraham put in damage claims with the federal government to be reimbursed for damages. As the owner of the property, Abraham put in his claim was for damages caused to the property, so damage to the house, the barn, the outbuilding, the fence rails. And as a renter, Henry's claim was for damages caused to his personal property, such as his household items, personal items, food, and also his farm products, livestock, hay, crops, anything he had in the barn, any grains he had in the barn, and any farm equipment he owned that was damaged, or if Abraham owned the farm equipment, he could put in for it too. Now, let's talk a little bit about the damage claims. Basically, it went like this. You submitted a claim. The government kicked it back for not having this or that information. You got those items and resubmitted, and the government kicked it back because something else was missing. This tended to go on for years, and in some instances, decades. I have literally seen damage claims that are still open in the mid 1880s, so over 20 years past the battle. This is your typical government operation of not wanting to pay. So it's a lot of back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. A lot of owners just gave up on the process. After a while, you just got some of the owners died, some of them moved, some of them just gave up. Some of the people who actually hired lawyers had a little bit better luck. On my property in particular, I know he hired a lawyer in 1866 and went after it right away, and he was reimbursed for the full amount of the damage. So if you had the money and you could hire a lawyer, sometimes that process went a little quicker. But in other humdinger, so the damage claim process was a lot of fun, you were only reimbursed if you could prove that your damage was caused by the Federal Army. So they would not reimburse you for Confederate damage. So for the people who were living in the rebel-controlled area, you could try to submit, but you probably weren't going to get anywhere. Now, Abraham Spangler put in a claim for $3,082.07. A combined total for damages to his Baltimore Pike property as owner and to his other property on the Chambersburg Pike where he lived during the battle. $3,082. When you consider that in 1860 the average value of somebody's house was about between $4,000 and $5,000, maybe $4,500, $5,000. That's an obscene amount of damage to a property. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of just how bad this was. Now, Abraham, since his Chambersburg Pike property was in rebel-controlled territory, you can bet he didn't get a cent of that portion of his claim. In 1871, he was awarded $2,633, which is a very significant award considering the fact that a lot of people were not awarded anything for their losses. A lot of people couldn't prove it. A lot of people gave up on it. So he got a pretty big award. So he put in for $3,082 and he got $2,633. Let's talk about awarded, because there's a lot of confusion. Everybody thinks, well, that's the amount of the check. No, just because someone was awarded a certain amount, it does not necessarily mean that that's the amount of compensation they received. Awarded refers to the amount of the damages that were approved as losses, so that they were proved and approved that the values were correct. Are we confused yet? Okay, now Henry put in his claim for $1,908.23, a combined total for personal damages at the Baltimore Pike property where he was a renter and owner damages to his other property on the Emmitsburg Road. In 1871, he was awarded $1,279.23, which is also pretty significant. But again, these farms were hit really hard. Unfortunately, I do not have the specifics of exactly how much they actually got in cash. I don't have that information, but their damage claims are available at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. if somebody wants to take a field trip. Let's talk a little bit now. That's battle. Let's talk after the battle. Life went on for the Spanglers. Pretty much everybody in this area, what were you going to do? You had to pick up and move on. You depended on your neighbors. You depended on your church to move on. It was a rough year. But Henry Spangler, he rebuilt, replanted, fixed the damage to the houses, and everybody tried to get back to their normal life. Tragedy struck the family just a couple months after the battle. On September 8th, 1863, Spangler's daughter, Anna, passed away at just 3 years old. She died of brain fever, so it's an old-time term, which actually meant like meningitis or typhus. There's actually a lot of speculation that battle-related disease caused a number of deaths following the battle. Quite a number of people died of typhus, especially when you go into the Evergreen Cemetery burial records, which are another wonderful source. There's a lot of people who died in that August, September, October time period, and a lot of typhus deaths. So the theory seems to be that a number of the wells were poisoned or polluted during the battle, and that's what caused so much death. But it could be that typhus was just making the rounds, as old-time diseases did back then, scarlet fever, consumption, that type of thing. We just don't know. In 1869, Abraham's son Levi actually took over renting the farm and would continue to do so until his father's death. So all of this time, from 1827 on, we're still under Abraham Spangler's ownership. So he owns throughout this entire period, up until his death on May 23rd, 1876. At 5:30 p.m. He died as the result of a fall. For the ghosties out there. It was exactly 5:30 p.m. We don't have any details on the fall. I don't know. Again, it's those wonderful Evergreen Cemetery burial permits that helped us out with that cause of death. We don't know what it was exactly, but he fell and died, maybe down the stairs. The property at that point transferred into his estate to await settlement. And on March 24th, 1881, the heirs of Abraham Spangler sold the farm to Samuel M. Bushman for $6,000. So since we have to keep our program here at a kind of reasonable length, and, I could talk about old houses and their owners forever and ever, I'm going to try to just quickly give you some of the highlights about the Bushman family, because these next owners from 1881 on this was some really interesting things that they did. Just a couple of facts. Samuel M. Bushman, who owned from 1881 to 1906, was a longtime bank teller and cashier for the First National Bank of Gettysburg. He was involved in a lot of various financial positions in the community, served on a number of committees. An interesting fact about Samuel Bushman, in 1899, he built the Masonic building on the Diamond in the Borough. This is actually the building that sits next door to the David Wills house. So downstairs today, I think it is a secondhand clothing store. He actually built that building. Here, another fun thing about Samuel Bushman is an article in a newspaper that I found in November of 1885 tells a really interesting story of one of Samuel Bushman's bulls charging a party of battlefield visitors who happened to be on his part of the field. The party happened to include many distinguished individuals, including General Winfield Hancock. Now, at the time of the visit, Hancock was the senior major general of the United States Army. And the writer of the article in the newspaper jokingly said to Hancock, "We can assure the gentlemen that their bovine acquaintance does not represent the kind of hospitality they would have received from his master." So that's a fun little battlefield story. And another one I found is in July of 1863, when General Buford's troops were passing through town, a group of girls went out to sing to the Union troops, and Samuel Bushman was actually he joined the girls in their singing. They're actually, you've probably maybe heard of them, called the Girls of 63. Now, on the evening of July 8th, 1903, in celebration of the 40th anniversary of the battle, the Girls of 63 sang again, and this time for the citizens of Gettysburg. who turned out to hear them. And Samuel Bushman once again lent his voice and sang alongside them that evening. So that's a neat little, I love the little facts like this. On January 11th, 1906, Samuel Bushman transferred the property to his brother William. By this time, the property had been cut down to 15 acres. So at one time, we were hovering around 200, 220. Over time, Samuel Bushman, throughout his ownership, sold off a lot of the land. He sold most of it to the battlefield. He cut off chunks of it. So it was under Samuel Bushman's ownership that the property really got cut down. So 1906, it's now 15 acres. What about William Bushman? Just again, some fun facts. He was a painter by trade, and in 1907 was awarded a contract to paint the towers on the Gettysburg battlefield. He would, again, in 1912, get the contract to paint them. He also had a contract in 1909 to paint the exterior of the Eagle Hotel in town. So Eagle Hotel was very well known. And he painted it cream with green trimmings, in case you're interested to know the color scheme. And he was also hired to paint the, quote, new St. James Church on York Street, which was new in 1912. In 1913, so this guy was kind of an interesting guy. In 1913, he actually left town and began his journey to Panama, where he worked with contractors to help finish the Panama Canal. So that's a nice little interesting fact about the owner of this house. On September 21st, 1918, William Bushman sold the property to his daughter, Blanche Christ. The property at this point had now been cut down to 2 acres. So again, more land is being sold. The property is now down to 2 acres. And that is actually, I believe, what it is today. Blanche's husband, David Christ, lived a very interesting life. He was the secretary, inspector, and representative of the State Department of Health for Gettysburg. What a job during the 1918 Spanish flu outbreak. He's mentioned all the time in the newspaper as dealing with the flu. He was working almost nonstop gathering information and reporting on cases of flu in his district, which encompassed Gettysburg and some of the extending areas for 5 miles in each direction. In 1921, David Christ actually resigned his position as the health officer and secretary of the Gettysburg Board of Health, and just up and changed his whole profession and decided to become work in sell general merchandise. And he actually moved to Walkersville, Maryland, and started a whole new business. On April 5th, 1924, Blanche Christ passed away from Bright's disease at the age of 37, and she left the property to David and her daughter, Miriam. Tragically, this is another very interesting story. In the early morning hours of Sunday, October 21st, 1928, David Christ was shot to death as he was about to enter his family home in Walkersville, Maryland. Though a robbery attempt was thought to be the motivation for the murder, Christ's body was found lifeless with $100 in his pocket, the day's receipts from his general merchandise business. Immediately after he was shot, neighbors heard Chris shout out, "Why did you do this?" as if he knew who his assailant was. Rewards were offered in the case, multiple leads were followed, and a special investigator was brought in from Baltimore. But unfortunately, the crime was never solved, so one of the owners of this property was murdered. So the property transferred to his 8-year-old daughter, inherited it. She had to wait, obviously, until she came of age to inherit. But when she did, it became hers. She died in 1994 and left it to her heirs. And just to wrap it up, though the names have changed, the current owners that own it today, who are the nicest people, are direct descendants of the Samuel Bushman line. So it's been in the Samuel Bushman family since 1881. And that is basically the top to bottom quickie history on the Abraham Spangler farm. So I hope you've really enjoyed this episode. It was a heck of a lot of fun for me. If you have questions, send me a shout on my Facebook page at Gettysburg House Histories. And if not, well, we'll be sure to talk to you next time. Take care.
Perfect. Bueno.